Bullets tore through the hot, dry air, snapping past like angry hornets. Boots pounded into hard-packed earth, spitting dust into the wind. Somewhere ahead, a man ran for his life, coat flapping, revolver clutched tight. Behind him, gunfire echoed off the low canyon walls, mingling with the harsh breath of pursuit. A voice, deep and unyielding, threaded through the chaos. The West was not won, it was survived. The words felt as old as the hills themselves, lingering as the scene slowed, dissolving into the vast, sunburned sweep of an untamed land. Hills rolled into endless plains, where shadows of clouds drifted lazily over the backs of wild mustangs. In crystal-clear detail, the frontier stretched to forever, every thorn, every cracked stone, every whisper of wind as sharp as the stories it carried. The West was beautiful, yes, but beauty here came with teeth. Days under the merciless desert sun baked a man from the inside out, left his lips cracked and his skin the color of worn leather. Rattlesnakes coiled in the cool shade of scrub brush, their tails whispering warnings in the language of death. Dust storms rolled across the horizon like living beasts, swallowing whole towns in their choking embrace. This was no place for the faint-hearted. But amid the hardship, legends were born. Bass Reeves, towering, relentless, dragged shackled outlaws through the heat of Texas. Annie Oakley, her rifle a natural extension of her arm, shattered glass targets midair before they could even think of falling. Wyatt Earp stood in the dust of Tombstone, eyes steady, his hand hovering over a Colt that could end a man's life before he took his next breath. Tonight, the voice promised, their stories live again. He rode alone. They called him the Lone Rider, though he had no claim to titles and no desire for fame. His face was worn by wind and sun, his coat frayed at the seams, his boots as tired as the man who wore them. He carried loss the way others carried guns, always near, always heavy. 2 winters ago, cholera took his wife. The fire that followed, set by hands he never saw, took the ranch they had built together. With nothing left but a stubborn heartbeat and a need to keep moving, he rode westward, not for gold, not for glory, but for answers. Somewhere in the dust and whispers of this land, he believed the truth about the legends waited. And somewhere in the distance, though he didn't yet know it, someone was watching him. A shape on a ridgeline, still as stone, face unreadable. The journey took him through echoes of history. He stood in the searing heat of an Oklahoma summer, watching Bass Reeves drag 3 outlaws into town, their faces caked with sweat and defeat. Reeves never broke stride, never loosened his grip, a living embodiment of the law in a land where law barely existed. Later, he wandered into a county fairground where a slim woman with sharp eyes and a sharper aim faced down a row of airborne glass spheres. Annie Oakley's rifle cracked 6 times in a breath, glass and sunlight exploded together in midair, raining glitter onto the crowd. In the mountains, under the shadow of pines, he glimpsed the fleeting figure of Geronimo, slipping through the brush like smoke, cavalry pounding fruitlessly after him. These moments were not just feats, they were fragments of people, real and flawed, surviving in ways the land itself demanded. It was on the 3rd day out from Dodge that he felt the eyes again. A soft rustle in the mesquite, a shift of shadow too deliberate to be wind. He kept riding, hand loose on the reins, pretending not to notice. The moment came when a dry rattle split the air, a diamond back coiled not 3 feet from his boot. He froze, muscles tightening, but before he could draw, an arrow flashed past his leg and pinned the snake's head to the dirt. He turned, but the archer was already stepping back into the shade. A man, or perhaps not a man at all, in worn buckskin, hair tied back, eyes like flint. His face was carved from hardship, lined with the stories of places few men had seen. He said nothing. With a brief nod, he vanished into the sage, as if he had never been there. That night, smoke from a distant fire smeared the horizon. By morning, the whispers began, low voices in saloons, tense glances between riders on the trail. The Black Spur gang had been sighted again. No one knew their number. No one knew when they would strike. But everyone knew what followed when they did: burned farms, empty homes, families left with nothing but graves to tend. From his place outside a trading post, the Lone Rider watched a line of wagons turn back east, their drivers unwilling to risk the road. Somewhere in that smoke was a reckoning, and the man in buckskin, silent and watchful, seemed to know it. Whatever road lay ahead, it would not be traveled alone, and it would not be traveled without blood. The desert stretched ahead like an endless furnace, its heat pressing down with the weight of an invisible hand. The sun hung mercilessly overhead, turning every shadow into a strip of blinding light. Dust clung to the skin, coating lips until they cracked. Somewhere above, vultures circled in patient arcs, their black wings cutting across the shimmering blue. The lone rider's throat burned with every breath, each swallow scraping raw against the inside of his neck. He kept riding, though his hands trembled slightly on the reins. Without a word, the man in buckskin drew up alongside him, his expression unreadable. He lifted his canteen and held it out. The lone rider accepted, drinking slow, deliberate swallows, the water warm but life itself in liquid form. No words passed between them, but in that quiet gesture there was understanding. By late afternoon, the wind began to shift. At first, it was only a whisper at their backs, but soon the air thickened, turning copper with the scent of dust. The horizon blurred. Sand rose in walls, rolling toward them with the speed of a stampede. The man in buckskin grunted something low in his native tongue and pointed toward a distant shape, crumbling adobe walls half swallowed by dunes. They pressed their horses hard, reaching the shelter of the old mission just as the storm broke. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with the musty scent of abandonment. By the flicker of a small lantern, they saw the scrawled messages on the walls, the scraps of maps and wanted posters left behind. One name appeared more than any other: Black Spur. The mission was no mere ruin. It had been a hideout. Far from the quiet ruin, life in the West still pulsed with danger. In the smoky backroom of a saloon in Abilene, Wild Bill Hickok sat across from men who hid cards up their sleeves and guns in their boots. His gaze was calm, almost bored, until a wrong word dropped like a match in a powder keg. Chairs scraped, guns flashed, and the air filled with thunder. Hickok didn't move until the first man drew, and by then it was too late. The Legends Colt roared once, twice, 3 times, leaving the table silent but for the drip of spilled whiskey. In Dodge City, Doc Holliday leaned against the bar, a glass in one hand, his other resting easy near his revolver. His cough rattled in his chest like loose dice in a cup, but his eyes were sharp as glass. When trouble came through the batwing doors, a pair of drunks, one waving a shotgun, Doc barely shifted. The fight was over in seconds, smoke curling upward while the piano played on as if nothing had happened. And somewhere along the windswept trails of the Indian Territory, Calamity Jane drove her stagecoach through a storm so fierce it erased the road. Sheets of rain blurred her vision, mud clawed at the wheels, but she leaned forward into the wind, cursing at the sky. The mail had to go through, and nothing, man nor storm, would stop her. These were the figures who carved their names into the bones of the West. Not saints. Not devils. Just people with the grit to keep moving when the land itself seemed to push back. Days later, the lone rider and his silent companion crossed into land where the air seemed to hum with unseen tension. Trails here were narrow and unmarked, winding between rock outcrops and scrub. Occasionally, they passed weathered totems or small stone stacks, markers that were not for them. The man in buckskin slowed near one such place, dismounting without a word. He pressed a hand to the earth and closed his eyes, murmuring something low, almost a prayer. The rider waited in respectful silence. When the man rose again, his gaze was fixed far away, as though measuring something unseen. The attack came under a moonless sky. One moment there was silence, the next, chaos. The crack of rifles shattered the night, followed by the screaming whine of bullets. Horses reared in panic, hooves pounding as men burst from the shadows. The rider barely cleared leather before the first outlaw was on him, a knife flashing in the dark. They crashed to the ground, grappling in the dirt, the metallic tang of blood already sharp in the air. The man in buckskin moved like a phantom, his bow in hand, loosing arrows into the dark before switching to a hatchet. Gunfire flared from the ridge, outlining the shapes of the Black Spur gang in jagged bursts of light. The rider fired, felt the kick in his arm, saw a man fall, but there were more. Too many. One lunged from behind, arm locking around his throat. The rider's vision tunneled, his hands clawing for the revolver he'd dropped. And then, release. The outlaw crumpled away, a knife hilt jutting from his back. The man in buckskin stood there, chest heaving, eyes burning. Another shot rang out, and the man staggered, a dark bloom spreading across his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, yanked the knife free from the fallen man, and pressed back into the fight until, at last, the gang retreated into the dark. They made camp not far from the battleground, the fire small and shielded from the wind. The rider cleaned the wound as best he could. Deadwood rose out of the Black Hills like a fever dream, part promise, part trap. The main street bustled with wagons, gamblers, and drifters, the sound of piano keys bleeding through saloon doors. But beneath the noise was an undercurrent, a quiet watchfulness. Men lingered too long in shadowed alleys. Women at the windows drew their curtains early. Locals spoke in hushed tones, trading glances before their words. The Black Spur gang ran Deadwood when the sun went down. No lawman stayed long, no merchant kept both his stock and his life without paying in gold or blood. The lone rider and the man in buckskin moved through the crowd like ghosts, every step measured. The storm was here. The wind carried with it whispers of the past, men who had faced chaos and stared it down. Wyatt, whose name was etched into the bones of Tombstone, a man who stood unflinching at the OK Corral while bullets screamed past. Kit Carson, the restless scout who traced the veins of rivers and trails across lands most dared not enter. Buffalo Bill, who took the dust and danger of the frontier and spun it into something larger than life, so the world might remember. These were not just names in a ledger, they were the blood in the veins of the West. As rain began to fall in thin, cold lines, the rider felt those stories take root in him. If they could stand their ground against storms of steel and fire, so could he. Tonight would decide whether Deadwood belonged to the people, or to the darkness that had claimed it. The night came with lightning that split the sky into jagged white scars. Rain turned the streets to black rivers, glistening under the flash of each bolt. The rider and his ally waited in the shelter of a livery stable, eyes fixed on the saloon where the Black Spur gang drank and dealt their poison. Then the first shot cracked through the storm, a muzzle flash painting the rain in fire. They stepped out into the open. Gunfire roared from the saloon windows, glass shattering as men spilled into the street, their shapes half swallowed by shadow and rain. The rider's revolver barked, each shot deliberate. Beside him, the man in buckskin moved like water, bowstring snapping, arrowheads finding their marks before steel even cleared leather. They were outnumbered, but the storm favored no man. Lightning blinded both sides, mud slowed the feet of friend and foe alike. The rider ducked behind a wagon, reloaded by feel, and rose to drop another man in the mud. He felt the presence before he saw it, one of the Black Spur stepping out from the rain with his gun leveled at the rider's heart. The shot came, but it wasn't the rider who took it. The man in buckskin lurched forward, his body absorbing the bullet meant for his companion. He grunted, the sound swallowed by the rain, and drove his knife into the outlaw's chest before falling to one knee. The rider's blood surged hot. He surged forward, revolver flashing until the street belonged to the thunder alone. The last of the Black Spur gang broke, fleeing into the black, their boots splashing in retreat. The rider turned back to his friend, kneeling beside him in the muck. The wound was deep, and even as the rider pressed his hands against it, he knew. The man's eyes found his, steady even through the pain. "Trust," he whispered. The word was soft but carried more weight than any he'd spoken before. His gaze drifted toward the light breaking through the storm, then closed for the last time. The rider stayed there as the rain eased, the silence of victory made bitter by the cost. Dawn crept over Deadwood, washing the streets in pale gold. The bodies of the Black Spur gang lay where they had fallen, those who had run were gone for good. Townsfolk emerged cautiously from doorways, faces pale but eyes alight with a new kind of hope. The rider mounted his horse slowly, the empty saddle of the man in buckskin trailing beside him. He left without ceremony, the road stretching ahead through the waking hills. The West was not built by men who sought comfort. It was carved by those who stood their ground when the odds laughed in their faces, who lost much but kept riding. Every grave along the trail was a story, every weathered face a chapter in the book of a land still half untamed. Tonight, you've walked their roads, felt their storms, and seen their shadows come alive. Their names may fade in the telling, but their spirit is stitched into the very horizon. If you've ridden this far with us, saddle up again. Like, share, and tell us, which legend of the West would you ride beside into the storm? The trail is long, and their stories are far from over.